have a statement with regard to the Mideast, which I think will anticipate some of the questions, because this will update the information which is breaking rather fast in that area, as you know, for the past 2 days. The ceasefire is holding. There have been some violations, but generally speaking, it can be said that it is holding at this time. As you know, as a result of the UN resolution which was agreed to yesterday by a vote of 14-0, a peacekeeping force will go to the Mideast. And this force, however, will not include any forces from the major powers, including, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union. The question, however, has arisen as to whether observers from major powers could go to the Mideast. My up-to-the-minute report on that, and I just talked to Dr. Kissinger 5 minutes before coming down, is this. We will send observers to the Mideast if requested by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And we have reason to expect that we will receive such a request. With regard to the peacekeeping force, I think it's important for all of you, ladies and gentlemen, and particularly for those listening on radio and television, to know why the United States has insisted that major powers not be part of a peacekeeping force, and that major powers not introduce military forces into the Mideast. A very significant and potentially explosive crisis developed on Wednesday of this week. We obtained information which led us to believe that the Soviet Union was planning to send a very substantial force into the Mideast, a military force. When I received that information, I ordered shortly after midnight on Thursday morning an alert for all American forces around the world. This was a precautionary alert. The purpose of that was to indicate to the Soviet Union that we could not accept any unilateral move on their part to move military forces into the Mideast. At the same time, in the early morning hours, I also proceeded on the diplomatic front. In a message to Mr. Brezhnev, an urgent message, I indicated to him our reasoning, and I urged that we not proceed along that course, and that instead that we join in the United Nations in supporting a resolution which would exclude any major powers from participating in a peacekeeping force. As a result of that communication and the return that I received from Mr. Brezhnev, we had several exchanges, I should say, we reached the conclusion that we would jointly support the resolution which was adopted in the United Nations. We now come, of course, to the critical time in terms of the future of the Mideast. And here, the outlook is far more hopeful than what we have been through this past week. I think I could safely say that the chances for not just a ceasefire, which we presently have, and which of course we have had in the Mideast for some time, but the outlook for a permanent peace is the best that it has been in 20 years. The reason for this is that the two major powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, have agreed. This was one of the results of Dr. Kissinger's trip to Moscow, have agreed that we would participate in trying to expedite the talks between the parties involved. That does not mean that the two major powers will impose a settlement. It does mean, however, that we will use our influence with the nations in the area to expedite a settlement. The reason we feel this is important is that, first, from the standpoint of the nations in the Mideast, none of them, Israel, Egypt, Syria, none of them can or should go through the agony of another war. The losses in this war on both sides have been very, very high. And the tragedy must not occur again. There have been 4 of these wars, as you ladies and gentlemen know, over the past 20 years. But beyond that, it is vitally important to the peace of the world that this potential trouble spot, which is really one of the most potentially explosive areas in the world, that it not become an area in which the major powers come together in confrontation. What the developments of this week should indicate to all of us is that the United States and the Soviet Union, who admittedly have very different objectives in the Mideast, have now agreed that it is not in their interest to have a confrontation there, a confrontation which might lead to a nuclear confrontation. And neither of the two major powers wants that. We have agreed also that if we are to avoid that, it is necessary for us to use our influence more than we have in the past to get the negotiating track moving again, but this time moving to a conclusion. Not simply a temporary truce, but a permanent peace. I do not mean to suggest that it is going to come quickly, because the parties involved are still rather far apart. But I do say that now there are greater incentives within the area to find a peaceful solution. And there are enormous incentives as far as the United States is concerned, and the Soviet Union and other major powers, to find such a solution.